Hey folks, so we are still in section 5.1, looking at the 5.1 notes, but I'd like to walk you through how to find an inverse using a four-step process. So we'll go through the process really quickly and then I'll give you an example. So first part of the process is that you want to change f of x just into a normal old y. We know that they're the same thing. Number two, you want to use that interesting fact that we talked about where the x's and the y's of the original will become the y's and the x's of the inverse. So number two is that you want to trade your x and your y. Number three, you want to solve for the new y. And then number four, you want to change that new y once it's by itself into f inverse of x. You cannot leave it as y. It's not the same thing as the original y. So I'd like to take you down to number 68, and we're going to find the inverse of number 68. So you see that I have my f of x, and the first thing that we want to do with f of x is we want to turn that into a y. So step number one, get rid of f of x, replace it with y. Step number two, trade your x's and your y's. Now notice I had multiple x's over here on the right, and they became multiple y's over here on the right. My x's became y's, my y's became x's. Now we want to, step number three, solve for the new y. This presents a little bit of a problem because there's not just a single new y. I have to somehow combine the two y's that I have into a single y. So we're going to work through this algebraically. So step number three is where we will begin this process, and I accidentally erased a little bit here. Take the x that's on the left side and multiply by the 5 minus y that's on the denominator on the right side. This is like cross multiplying. It's also just getting rid of your fractions. After we do that, we're going to do a bit of distribution. So we want to take our x and pass it out to the quantity. So you see what that gives us, a 5x minus an xy is equal to a 3y. Now notice I have 1, 2, 3 terms in this equation. What I want to do is I want to get all of the y terms on one side of the equation and the non-y terms on the other side of the equation. So you'll notice that I took that negative xy and moved it over to the right side using addition. Well, now I can use a little bit of factoring. Yes, we are back at factoring. And you'll notice that I took that y that was in the two terms over here on the right side and I factored it out. This is undistribution, but it's called factoring. And now I only have a single y, so I can get my y by itself. So the next thing I'm going to do is divide on both sides by 3 plus x. Now that y is by itself, I can finally go to step number 4. And step number 4 said take that y out and replace it with f inverse of x. So that's going through your 4 steps. I've also worked through number 74. I think you already have the work for this if I remember correctly, but I wanted to work through it again with you really quickly. Just one more, going through the 4 steps. Step number 1, get rid of your f of x, turn it into a y. Step number 2, trade the x's and the y's. Step number 3, start solving for that new y. So I started moving things to the other side. That was the first step. I subtracted 4 on both sides. And then the next part of that is I'm going to divide on both sides by negative 3. This is like the onion layer method that we talked about in class. The next step is that I want to get rid of that cube. So I'm going to take the cube root of both sides. And then once I have the cube root of both sides, and I accidentally erased my index of 3 there. Once I have the cubed root of both sides, I also have my y by itself because the cube and the cube root undo each other. And you know that you cannot leave that as a y, so then the last step is that I'm going to have to, and there again, I've left out my index, I'm going to have to change my y that I had into f inverse of x. And that takes care of those two examples. You can forget the extra parts there. We will talk about those in class.